Well, hi everyone, and welcome Namali, and welcome Jeff, and welcome Lee. Today we'll be interviewing Jeff Salzman, who is the host for the Daily Evolver podcast. And the Daily Evolver podcast looks at politics and culture through an integral lens, so using integral theory to interpret and make sense of current and past political and cultural events. And the tagline for the Daily Evolver podcast is a post-progressive look at politics and culture. And we'll get into what that means later in this interview. But first, I would like to start off, and Namali as well, with some appreciation of you, Jeff. And the reason is that you've been the podcast host for the Daily Evolver for many years. And one of the things that both Namali and I appreciate is that you've been very courageous and authentic in the way that you are growing and evolving in public. So if we look at the first Daily Evolver podcasts, then they're different from the ones from this current period. And one of the reasons that Namali and I see that this is the case is because you allow your perspective on reality to evolve by being open to receiving influence from other people and other thinkers and other perspectives. And to me and to Namali also, this is very inspiring and laudable. So thank you for being you.
Well, thank you. Yeah. Well, I actually think that that is something that wants to come online as you move into integral consciousness, which is this bigger space that is able to hold multiple perspectives, so multiple worldviews. And once you're able to do that, you want to do that. And so, there's just a natural move from being critical to being curious, and that you, to hold on to a form is the booby prize in a way, is that I realize now that I am an evolving Jeff in an evolving cosmos, and everybody around me is evolving too. That's the real realization. That's of the capital R realization of integral, is that we see that we're an evolving system. Oh my God. And oh my God, isn't that interesting? Mm-hmm. There's something that just wants to open up to this thing is alive. And we're being lived. And we can look at history in a way that, we couldn't look at history in the way we can now, in the last 50, 100 years. We just know so much. We can see this ever-evolving saga, actually, that goes back to the Big Bang. And then, that is, well, I guess I could go on, but if just to sort of navigate the territory of what integral is that we see integral coming online in two stages. One we call teal or yellow in spiral dynamics, and turquoise, which is the same in both systems, spiral dynamics and the Wilberian system. And the first one is where we start to see that, first of all, we get tired. This is why I call my podcast now Post-Progressive Insights, is that we start getting suffocated by the ideologies that have nurtured us, that have really taken us some distance in terms of our own evolution. And for me, that would be progressivism. I moved to Boulder so that I could be in the green meme, we call it. And I drank deeply of it and still do and want to continue. But that's not all anymore. That's not enough. And so I start being friendly to the earlier systems of modernity and traditionalism and things that have been marginalized by postmodernity or green. And I start seeing the truth of them. And so there's this new system of systems that I'm able to see that we call teal. And that's complexity and all of the good stuff. There's lots of people sort of thinking in these terms. This is the natural next step. That includes green and all of the stuff, but now it includes more than just green. It includes the whole spiral, we say, of development. I can feel my humanity, in some ways, my identity going back to the Big Bang, but that's a bit much. So that's that teal stage. And then there's the turquoise stage, which is the one that I referred to a minute ago, where you think, Jesus, Lord, oh my goodness, what's going on here? You know, this thing is alive and I am being lived, and what's next for me? And so I think there's a natural opening where you become, you know, I want to be challenged. I want my current structures to be dismantled. I don't want to keep swimming in the same grooves that I had been. And I'm 66, you know, I hope to go out that way. But I think that's one of the gifts of Integral, really, is that realization of evolution and, oh my God, what's next?
Nice. So Jeff, thanks for a sort of a very broad perspective on reality that you bring indeed to your podcast, but also to your conversations outside of the podcast, of course. And something for listeners perhaps, or viewers who have not yet encountered you, what could you say about yourself that that could introduce yourself in a way that you like to introduce yourself the most?
Well, actually, it's funny. What comes to mind is something, Namali, that you'll recognize. And this is a exercise that you and I did when we ran the Integral Incubators. And Namali and I were part of a small team that started Boulder Integral, which was a bricks and mortar. We had an old church and did programs on all kinds of things. And one of the things that we would do to identify ourselves and introduce ourselves was we would chart the moments, the big moments of each evolutionary stage as we lived them in this life, because each of us starts at square one as an individual. So does humanity. So we're looking at sort of this collective evolution of humanity, but each one of us starts where it's just, Lord, we wake up into self-consciousness at some point. We stop wanting to poop the bed, you know, and then we can see, and there's something, once you get hip to this system, where there's something that sticks out for all of us as we move from one stage to the other. And so I would just do that very quickly. And that is, I grew up I was born into a small coal mining town in Western Pennsylvania. And my parents hadn't gone to college, and we were a very small town, and we lived with my mother's grandmother. And so I lived there for the first 4 years of my life, my great-grandmother's house in a sweet little town. And so I have a nice demarcation at 4 years old of what happened before and after, and those are pivotal. So this at age 2, 3, that's where we're melded with our families. And it starts with mother, father, and it moves out to aunts and uncles. And I had all of that, and that's a wonderful thing. Before we started recording, we were talking about secure attachments and how helpful that is. And I had a lot of that. And then I realized, so this is my first real entry from that sort of tribal, in what we would call the beige or in purple or indigo stages of sort of pre-conscious tribal melded with other people. And then there's a self-consciousness that comes online, not just self-consciousness comes on at the beginning, but what happens is ego comes online, and I get fully differentiated from family. And we all did that. It's not pleasant, it's not pretty, it's frightening. But I remember the key moment for me was when it stopped being okay for my mother to give me a bath in the kitchen sink in front of her girlfriends. I was not going to have that. I remember no problem, and then all of a sudden problem. So I remember that. So that's my sort of entry into red, and so then I do that. And that's this first egoist stage. And then there's an oscillation that happens between collective and agentic, or individual and collective. So then after that, I, like a lot of good boys and girls, wanted to be a good boy and girl. And so, I'm Christian. I learned about Jesus, and I feel his presence, and I move into traditionalism, which is where you civilize that red. And you be a Boy Scout or Girl Scout, you go to church camp or whatever it is you do, even Dungeons and Dragons to some degree. It's this kind of thing where you get organized around the principles of being good and obedient, and that the world makes sense, and there's somebody looking down and somebody loves me, and all of that good stuff. So then I become, church camper of the year and whatever, and I'm a good little Christian boy. And then I start learning science. And, it's like, so what's this again about God sent his only begotten son as a blood sacrifice to forgive me for my sins? And how's that? What's up with that again? And, I lose my religion, as do a lot of people as they move into that stage. And I would say, just as a point of education, we're talking about, how we move forward in different lines and so forth. And what I'm talking about here is just this sort of deep identity, or what we call self-sense, where our heart is. And there are people who never leave that traditional, the world is lit up by the love of God, and this world is not my home, that stage. What a beautiful stage that is. And there are people all over the world, all over the country, that's where their heart still is through adulthood. And they may move into modernity in terms of functionality and career and so forth, but their hearts are there. But my heart moved forward. I didn't want that anymore. And I moved into a modernist worldview. And like a lot of modernists, I fell for the high priestess of modernity, Ayn Rand, and started reading Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged, and The Fountainhead. And she teaches she escaped communist Soviet Union, and she had this anti-collectivist bent, and she talked about these heroic people and the difference between these heroic people and the people who are always hanging on, trying to drag them down and trying to suck off of them. And so Atlas, that's the whole point of Atlas, these people who are actually building and running the world, these great capitalists, shrug and say, fuck you all. And we're going off and you guys take care of it. And of course it doesn't work. So and of course, Ayn Rand is also very secular. So religion is ridiculous and very modern in the sense of aesthetics and leaving all of the bric-a-brac and all of the history behind and going for a sleek modern aesthetic. And so I remember at age 16, using my lawn mowing money to buy a subscription to her newsletter called The Objectivist for, at that time, $80 a year. And my dad being furious that that's what I would choose to spend my hard-earned money on that I made, $5 at a time. But I was happy to, because that was my definition. And I became an atheist, and a mouthy one at that, got in trouble at the church, and moved that modern thing into college, at which point, so that Ayn Rand was sort of the moment of moving into modernity for me. Reading The Fountainhead was the first one. So then I go to college, and I can remember, like my sophomore year, I'm still very modern, still very aesthetic, secular, atheistic. And I go to a friend's house, and she has me sit on the couch. She hands me a joint, and I've had marijuana a couple times, which there it was. And she played Close to the Edge by Yes, which is a 30-minute psychedelic rock song, one whole side of an album. And I started that at Orange Modernity, and I ended 30 minutes later at Green Postmodernity. I literally felt my whole world open, and it was never going to close back up again. And that was a moment for me for entering Green. So most of college, drinking up counterculture and anti-capitalist politics and all of the good stuff of Green, high sensitivity. I moved to Boulder, Colorado, so that I can marinate in it further and do all of the teachers that come through here and the swamis and the Buddhist community here, and loved it, still do. Got my master's degree in divinity in Indo-Tibetan studies at Naropa. And kissed all of the frogs, and at some point that became a liberal instead of a conservative, voted Democratic, all of that good stuff. But at some point that becomes not enough. And it did for me in the sense that I could remember that I was the one guy of all of my friends who wouldn't and couldn't choose a teacher, you know, the person that I would be devoted to. And because that's what seemed like it was the thing to do at that time, and what felt like next to me. And, but I couldn't, and I didn't, until one day, and as I've told this story a million times, and I'll tell it quickly, I walked into a bookstore and there was a book on the shelf called Up from Eden by Ken Wilber. And this is probably sometime in the early mid-'80s. I don't remember exactly when. But that was the moment I entered Integral, that moment. Before I saw that title, I was green. And after I saw that title, I was green. It was like, oh, I get it. Up from Eden. We didn't fall from paradise. We haven't done, you know, we're rising here out of the swamps, and I can see history fall into place in a new way. And I bought the book, and, you know, by morning, I knew that I had found my teacher. I had found a new worldview, and I was not just finding a new worldview. You're in new territory when you move from one of these stages to the next. It's a whole big 4-quadrant affair, if you know the lingo. So that was my teal entree, and I recovered some of my conservative ideas. I opened up to different kinds of, you know, ways of seeing God and spirit. I did the sweat lodges and chanted and meditated and all of that good stuff. Beautiful stuff, fantastic stuff. Still do much of it. And then one day I was reading a book, and I remember this is my moment from, I would say, my move from teal into turquoise. And I was at a park with my dog beside a creek, not far from my home. And I finished reading the book, The Road Less Traveled by M. Scott Peck, it was the biggest book of its day. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for 13 years. I think it's got the Guinness Book of World Records for that. It was a very influential book. I actually got to work with Scott Peck later in my life. I couldn't believe it, but I did. And what he does in the book is he's a psychiatrist and a wise man, and he makes a intellectual case for the existence of God, essentially, for the existence of an organizing, loving principle that is at work in the universe. And I needed an intellectual case for that. I couldn't just go there in my heart. And so I remember finishing the book and closing it up and walking home and thinking that was very interesting. And that's about it. Had a regular evening. And the next morning, I woke into a altered state where I remember waking up, and I woke out of a dream that felt more vivid than a dream. We might call a vision, you know, these are categories we can sort of think about. But it was the bell of the church of my childhood ringing. And I could see the front of my church and hear the bell of the church ringing. And I woke up, and I always think of the line from Carl Jung. It's like, I didn't believe in God, I knew God. I was filled with God. God was everywhere. And so that lasted for a couple days. And it's the only time I've really, I've had certainly many altered moments and so forth, but never a sustained thing. And of course, this is well known, and I had one, hallelujah. And so I never went back to atheist. I was always just lit up by the love of God in some way that was mysterious to me at this point. And it wasn't until years later, actually not that long ago, this is, you know, decades later, where I realized that, wait a second, the church in my childhood church, bell never rang. They didn't, the bell tower was closed up. They didn't even, I don't know if the bell was even up there, but I never once heard it ring as a child, but it was ringing now. And I thought that was an interesting way of looking at that religion of my childhood coming alive in a way that it couldn't have then. and didn't, and does now, that the bell's actually ringing. So I know there's more to come, and there's a next Jeff, and I don't know what it is, and I don't care that much, honestly, because I got plenty on my plate here. I know that in some ways this Jeff will continue. In some ways that is mysterious to me. He came from somewhere, he, she, it came from somewhere. We all have. We're on sacred journeys in some way that is, I don't know what, that we meet each other is a blessing. We've probably met before, we probably will again. The love we make is equal to the love we take. You know, I'm inspired now by Ken's teaching, Ken Wilber, who's still my wonderful capital T teacher. We don't communicate much, but you know, I can't unlearn what he gave me. And he talks about that what evolves, what continues after this life is our realization of oneness. So to the degree that we have realized that we are waves in an ocean, so we're both the wave and the ocean, that gets to stay with us. And the second is the sum of our good works and our relationships and the love we make. And so what that does, that I'm so grateful for, is it re-enchants life. It's like everything that happens is meaningful. It's like that sacred journey. It's the hero's journey, I guess, right? Where every person you meet, you know, think of the fairy tale, the old crone and this one crawling out from under the bridge. And, you know, there's awful people that you meet. Oh my God. They're all there to teach you something. You know, the trees talk, the clouds talk, you know, everything's alive. You're in the middle of all of it. Everything you do is consequential. It matters to your immortal soul. And, you know, enough already. This is a full enough plate for me, and I'm gnawing on it as best I can as the daily evolver. I'm the guy who's evolving daily and sort of knows it on a good day. You know, otherwise I'm a robot, you know, like most people, but, you know, trying to wake up into this, trying to stabilize it. You know, what a joy it is. As long as we define joy as the thing that includes unhappiness and misery and suffering. Yeah.
Well, wonderful, Jeff, and another beautiful arc of a story indeed. Of your own life mapped across the stages of development. And perhaps this could also be a good time to elucidate what you mean by the new tagline for the Daily Evolver podcast. So a post-progressive look at politics and culture, because you've just also described in your own personal life the leap from, let's say, pre-progressive and progressive to a post-progressive worldview. Mm-hmm. So could you speak to the evolution of your tagline?
Yeah.
Also, maybe just a little bit about what got you into creating the Daily Evolver and what keeps you going.
Yeah. Well, it's, I think I can answer both of those at the same time by, you know, pointing out that when we talk about evolving from one of these stages to the next, and by the way, you can go to dailyevolver.com and hit theory, and you'll get a nice little succinct description of integral theory, remedial. But one of the things that is happening, one of the engines of evolution, is that we include what's come before, and then we transcend it. And so one of the things that, and we differentiate and integrate. So we're always looking to, you know, tease things apart and move them from being sort of fused and confusing to clear, and then integrating them. And so just using that basic theory, one of the ways forward for people who are at what we call exit green. So these are people who are stably postmodern. They've gotten the memo about sensitivity and the sins of history and the power dynamics and all of the sham of triumphalists, my race, my culture, all of this bullshit, religion being superior. They got that. And that's an achievement of history and evolution that is magnificent. And it's not the end. So one of the ways of moving forward is through integrating the stages that have come before that. So we have secular modernity, you know, sort of a capitalist and kind of mindless and ignorant, but also tremendously fruitful. And then we have traditionalism, this world of God and country. And so post-progressive, this move beyond progressive, is some version of befriending those two in ways that isn't natural to Green. Green is the antithesis. Green hates businesses the way modernity and traditionalism instinctively hate government. You know, there's just that you're either one or the other. These two behemoths, and you either magnetize towards one and hate the other, or the other way around. And so we see that there's a polarity that is particularly green and postmodern green and traditionalism, or what we call amber or blue in spiral dynamics. They really, these are the two communal memes. Modernity is kind of the individual meme in between. These are the ones that really truly hate each other. And one of them, and I talked a little bit about it, that it's the grievance side of the street is the green postmodern, where you see the horrors of history and how it's one just goddamn nightmare after the other of people oppressing one after. I mean, it's just, you know, right up to the middle of the 20th century, and still continuing in parts of the world. That's a history that has to be told. That's a story that has to be seen. And so we see it in Green in ways that arise as anti-capitalist, as revisionist history, that they want to dismantle the stories of traditionalism. So let's just set that aside for now and go to the stories of traditionalism. So the story of traditionalism is this heroic story of, and I'll use America because that's my country, but every country has one. Especially, you know, once you get into postmodern, you can look back and see that part of the story. It is that triumphalist part. And it is that sort of God and country, and families take care of themselves. And there's something bigger than this world. And there's something more important than money. And, you know, there's something that is, that we want to have pride and gratitude for our country and for what it's achieved, because, you know, you could look at the sins of history and see, you know, that it's one catastrophe after the other. But you can also see that on the other side of the street, it's this amazing growth of goodness, truth, and beauty. Oh my God. And that they're both the same. I mean, this universe, whoever came up with this universe was not screwing around. I mean, it is one challenge. And so, but this is the challenge of moving into integral thinking, is that we want both stories to be, they're both true. So we want to see that, you know, Thomas Jefferson was this paragon. I mean, the Declaration of Independence is an achievement in human history that it was just solidified modernity. The idea of liberty is in my breast. I'm no longer subject to the king. I am my own free agent. I mean, it's inspired people all over the world. And he owned slaves. He owned slaves. He bought and sold them. He serially raped one, if you want to, by Green standards, because she was his mistress for decades. So, so which of those? I mean, so this is the culture war, and Integral asks us to both stories, to hold both stories, and that's, you know, it's not rocket science, honestly, but it does require that you move outside your comfort zone. And you let some heresies back in that were verboten. There's just this sort of God and country thing itself. Postmodernity is very conflicted about the nature of, you know, God, certainly. I mean, God's out, forget God in terms of any kind of a, you know, mythic being. but green will get into nature spirits, and it's great. Green's doing its thing to in some ways integrate the earlier stages of the culture. Again, that's where you sit in sweat lodges. But there's still this thing where the world is, there's a bummer quality. There's a disenchantment of the world that persists in green. The modern disenchantment of the world, where everything is reduced to material, to what we would call the right-hand quadrants, and consciousness, all of it. We're just, these are still the best-selling authors of these science book, Brian Greene and Sam Harris, and all of them. We've talked about this. They all have, we're basically big lumbering robots. There's no interiority, and I can't, how that is like the law of the intellectual land is astonishing to me. But at any rate, green softens us up a little bit, but by the time we get into particularly turquoise, the world is fully re-enchanted again. I mean, you can, and the great thing about integral is we can then drink of all these beautiful wells of all of the streams of religion and spiritual practice. And we could sit at the foot of every teacher and master in history, to the degree that we can read their writings. And so that's a wonderful thing, and it comes together. It starts flying in formation when we get to integral, instead of just sort of being, sort of a confused, chasing many rabbits sort of quality of green. So I don't know, I sort of rambling there. Where are we?
We were asking about what does everything that you just said, that's how I'm assuming that's what you're trying to communicate through the Daily Volver.
Yeah.
We've been
Exactly.
asking about Daily Volva and what caused you to change the name recently? It's just kind of a simple curiosity we've been having.
Yeah, it used to be called an integral view of politics and culture. And there's a couple things. One is integral's sort of a term that's used in a particular way among people who are initiated into integral theory, if you will. And so if you Google integral, you get integral yoga, you get integral mathematics. It's a little bit confusing. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted something that was, an easy on-ramp to what I'm talking about, which is this post-green. We hear postmodernism. We hear metamodernism. There are a lot of people who know. I mean, people know that there's something next coming in a way in their gut. But it's funny that post-progressive it's actually Steve McIntosh, who is my friend, neighbor, and also my great integral teacher, great integral philosopher, just wrote a book called Developmental Politics. And he and I talk a lot. And we were sitting in my dining room there in front of the fireplace, where you've been many times, Namali. And he just used the term post-progressive in what he was talking about. And my chimes went off. It was like, wow, that's a great term. And I've heard it, I guess, or have I? And we actually Googled it, and it turns out there's not much on it. There's a post-progressive rock and roll genre. And there was a guy who talked about post-progressive, but he was talking about in terms of, the Young Turks and Bernie and just a more militant faction of progressivism. But in terms of it being another stage in human history, so then Steve and I thought, wow, maybe there's not that much magnetized around this term, and it's a really obvious term, and really it's self-descriptive. It doesn't, it's not a label. And by God, we looked and we got the URL.
Yeah, that's
for
awesome.
postprogressive.com.
Wow, that's awesome.
It's like, so God must want us to have postprogressive.com. I don't know what we're going to do with it, but I think it's a nice on-ramp term, and that's why I've used it. And again, I see this, when we talk about progressive, generally we mean politics, but we also know that it means culture. There's a progressive culture, and that's that green culture that went from Andy Griffith, to MASH and All of the Family, and that we could feel that move to green. And so there's, the post-progressive describes something that's moving beyond that in terms of culture too. And so I like to look at movies that I consider to be integral, or, look at movies and cultures and TV shows and so forth, as well as politics.
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Thank you. So we have a bunch of questions that we came up for you today.
Cool.
And I love, obviously we're getting to see the classic Jeff, and, what is simmering inside of you constantly. It's really delightful to see that. What I'm sometimes really fascinated with you is that you're so hooked on, you're so plugged into this that you kind of get into a flow state with this integral and post-progressive, or the world in general. I think your thinking is very fascinating to look at, and how you express that. And it's like you can't really help what you just did all this time.
Right. No.
You can't really help it. That's just how you show up.
Exactly.
Yeah. So because we know that you can be like this, we also wanted to just ask you some really simple other questions that are maybe perhaps, who knows, you may not be able to unhook yourself from integral because you're so plugged in that way of expressing yourself. But so to the degree that you want to go integral or not is totally up to you, and we would welcome it either way. But we have just some simple curiosities around, who is Jeff really?
Yeah, right on.
Yeah. So one of my kind of questions that I want to pose to you is really simple, but we're both really curious about, is, as who you are today, what is something that has happened significant in your life that you feel like it just changed you as a human being? That it just fundamentally, I'm not going to be the same anymore.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting, if I could just go back to how you introduced this question, is to what degree can I think, do I just naturally think integrally?
Mm-hmm.
And to what do I or what is it to not, or whatever. So I just naturally have an integral answer to that. And
Mm-hmm.
that is, I mean, to a certain degree, at this point in my life, I'm 66, and I'm retired, if you will. I do this podcast, and I do my garden, and I kind of like to stay home anyway. So, the social distancing is not really a big challenge for me, But so what I have the freedom to do is look at everything in terms of how it's changing me, and I feel like, for instance, if I look at my personal edge of growth over the last couple years, even since I've done the podcast, it's actually in many ways an increase of my green consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
It's more of the understanding of the karmas of history regarding women. I mean, I think about women differently now than I did before Me Too. I think we all do. I mean, that's the other thing, is I see that in the culture at large, is that there was some gauzy filter of, that's a woman, that I saw every woman through, instead of, windshield wipering that a little bit and saying, oh, okay, I see you. And, the woman thing recedes. And that's what we all want. And I'm, being a gay guy, I always think, I thank God I can kind of like float. I don't want to always be the gay guy. I'm the gay guy, but I don't want to be the gay guy. And so it's a relief to me with people of color, women, all of them, this new ability to see through the conditioned mind, basically, the just habitual mind. And it's not just habitual mind, it's habitual heart and gut. We feel that all the way up our central channel, that there's a widening and saying, oh, I see you. I get this. I always love Emerson's line, I've used it 1,000 times, that each church has a congregation of one. Each one of us is a universe in and of ourselves. So I want to do that and really practice what it is to, it's just like last night. So my friend, and you know her, Namali and Michelle, she has her garden, and I have my garden, and we are garden buddies. And she has an attitude about her garden, and she's one of the people that I know who I would consider to be spiking in the line of aesthetic genius in a couple ways. Culinary and gardens are two of them, where she just has a natural genius in these two areas. And her thing is to just let it be and let it go. And the critters need to have a space and realize, so I'm walking around this garden that I did. They're out there working on it now, finishing it up. And I have put all kinds of new things in, and I'm moving from that attitude. I used to have the attitude of let it be, and we don't want to impinge on nature and that sort of thing. And I grew up in the woods, and I grew up with weeds along the country road, and everything's a thicket and everything's jaggers. And I realized at some point, I don't want that anymore. I want things that are manicured. I want shapes. I want the Palace of Versailles, for God's sakes. I want I want that kind of, I want a city garden. I don't want to let it go. So I'm showing her my garden. And she's sort of coming from her thing about just let that be and don't too much. And I feel my resistance to it. And I want to argue. And so here we have, this is life, right? This is worldviews collide. And this is welcome to humanity, especially at this stage of development. And I deliberately noticed it. And that's all you can do. That's what only practice gives you a better chance of noticing it. It's not a sure thing. But I did. I noticed what I was doing, and I deliberately relaxed it. And it's not that hard once you do it a few times. It feels like you're going to die because you are. Actually, this hardened, clenched part of you is going to die. And I let in her worldview. And oh my God, hallelujah. I mean, I felt like I experienced my garden in a whole new way, where she was right about this and that. Not just this and that. She was right in a fundamental way about the garden, where she was actually seeing it more as an evolving unit than I was. I was playing with it as if it was an ikebana, forever there. And she was actually seeing that dimension of movement, which is what we're after in Integral. We all want to see the movement and everything. Everything's a verb, in Integral. And she had that, and I didn't, about this garden, my garden. And so that's and I can feel it even now in my sort of a warmness of, and also a fear in my body. I feel both those things. And this is, you start getting hip to what that is. And so now I feel like I have, and this is, we often think, so we get these polarities, these two dueling worldviews, and then we have an integration. What does that actually mean? And it has to have a felt quality. And I'm feeling it. I feel like I let that in from her, and I breathed it in. And this morning, I felt like I walked into an even more enchanted garden because of it. And hallelujah,
Yeah.
Well, something like that. That's what's changing me. And other, big events. I mean, Trump. He changed me too. Everything changes me, and I think that's okay. And that's what turns me on these days.
Nice. Thank you.
Okay, well, another excellent story, Jeff, and thanks for providing us with insight into not just you, but also your experience in real time of reality.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's fun.
So moving on to a different type of question, and one more related to imagination and history, because I know you are quite a history buff, and that you're well versed in history of many places of the world. So the question I would like to put to you is, if you could travel as a passive observer, so you can't influence anything, but if you could travel to one moment in history, which moment would you choose and why?
Oh my God. Wow. Well, as long as I mean, I wouldn't want to be in any of them, really, in a certain way. I mean, history is dangerous. You look back on human history, and would I want to walk down the streets of Rome? I'm not so sure, you know. But here's what came to mind when you said that, and it's caught my fancy. There's a documentary called Man's First Friend. And it's a new documentary on dogs, and it's very well done in a sort of a new way. I think it actually is worthy of integral consideration in terms of the aesthetic. It uses both reenactments and hard history and statistics and sort of these world maps, and it charts the evolution of the dog. And the evolution of the dog, here's where I would like to go to answer your question of the moment in human history. And so here it is. So we have human beings, and they're living in bands, and bands maybe 20 people, and it's a hard knock life. And they have fire, and they are, good enough hunters and the gatherers. And so there's the humans. And then there's the wolves. And there's a she-wolf, there's a female wolf that is not making it in the pack. And she's shy, and she can't get in there and eat. And they try to let her, but then some of them won't. And there's this whole thing that happens with wolves where there's sometimes an ejection of a wolf from the pack, and it's a sad thing. But this she-wolf there was just something that in that time, in that moment, and this may have been happening around in different places, but she sort of decided she was going to try her luck with the humans. And so she goes to the human camp and gets a scrap, and one thing leads to the other. And it reminds me of a meme I have. And I passed it around, and people have passed it back. I think I probably said it to you, Namali. And it shows a wolf in one panel and saying, 20,000 years ago is the caption, 20,000 years ago. Maybe I'm going to try my luck with the humans. How bad could it be? And then the next panel is of a pug wearing a knitted birthday cake on its head. So, so that's how bad it could go for the wolf. And so that moment in history where the first canine, where the first wolf joined the humans, is a time I would love to see. That would warm my heart. And what we have done with dogs in the creation of dogs. Let's talk about the emergence of goodness, truth, and beauty. There's Exhibit A. Is the dog. That's the other side of history, But you could see that, and this is another thing that I can see, and people comment on it, I'm not the only one by any means, that there seems to be just moments in human history where it's time for the wolves all over the place to approach the humans. And then there's a time in human history where all across the globe, including in the Americas, people start cultivating plants. And that just was time. There was a morphic field that was emerging. And then there's a time where the power gods are no longer that interesting, and they don't really seem to work that reliably anyway. And you realize everybody, or all around the world, there's a transcendent God in the sky, or there's a transcendent state, nirvana, which is, where that is sort of interpenetrated with reality. And there seems to be these moments in human history where it just wants to happen. And so that moment of the wolf, the she-wolf, entering the circle of the fire, that's the moment for me.
Okay, well, thanks, Jeff.
I'm actually curious about the entry to the time when these animals and the human integration might have happened, is what you talked about.
Yep.
Why are you curious about that particularly?
because it's such a new world that opens, you know, and this, and it also shows something that is, I think, comes online at Integral in general, is this realization that animals are people too.
Mhm.
And actually tribal people had an indigenous, you know, back when we were at that stage, we humans, we saw animals as brothers and sisters, and you know that we had they had a self to them, and we were melded. It was all, you know, the spirits were just flowing between them and us in ways that actually want to come back online now.
Mhm.
You know, this is the integration of that. And we're seeing that with, I think, the realization of animal suffering is almost too much to bear for humans. But it's like it's funny, I was reading the New York Times this morning, as I have done every day for 30, 40 years. And they always talk about the most read article of the day before. And so yesterday's most read article was, I forget the name of it, but it's by Jonathan Safran, Foer. He's a novelist who wrote a book called Eating Animals. And it's basically, the title was, It's Time to Stop Eating Animals. And that is, you know, you're a vegetarian, Namali. I'm omnivore. I am working on it. I'm a terrible hypocrite, but I am getting more and more, even in the last, you talk about things that have, you know, what's really influenced me, what's changed me. Well, it's like this polarity that we're talking about. It's like sometimes you got to, you know, clarify the frothy edge on one side of the polarity and really get into it so that you could have an expansion into the other. And I have always been the guy who, I can't watch animals suffer. I can go buy their meat, you know, wrapped in cellophane, no problem. And I think it's delicious. And I have all kinds of wonderful recipes. And I have the sort of arrested at traditional palate. You know, I want what my mother made. That's what I want to eat. You know, so I have that. But I also now have this thing where I can't see animals suffer. And so there's this terrible sort of confused, guilt-ridden, subject to, you know, compulsion, you know, doing what I don't want to do. You know, that's a whole thing. A lot of people are struggling with this. It's something that happens at this stage of development. We want to actually see that and welcome it. But it wasn't until maybe a week and a half ago where my friend Maria sent me a video of Esther the pig. And it's Esther's this pig that these two gay guys got. They thought it was going to be a mini pig. It was actually a big farm sow. And they fell in love with it. And so they had to change their life to accommodate Esther. Mm-hmm. So what she sent me was a TED talk of Esther the pig. And there's a whole thing now. They have the Twitter and the Facebook and they have a farm and they get money. It's great. They're fabulous. And Esther, I think, is still with, she has a emotional support turkey. I forget what her name is, but she's also loves to be hugged and kissed. And it's like, so I saw that. So I could see that, but I still can't see the suffering part. But at the end of the TED Talk, a couple images that surprised me of pigs in industrial settings where they're not seen. There's no thou there. They're units of production. They're meat factories. And then even the execution. And there was a couple images of that. And I was shocked and outraged, and I saw something I didn't want to see and was not willing to see. And since then, I've had my slip-ups, but I'm doing way better. A whole new consciousness to eating meat. And, you know, this thing of New York Times, these are the things that change me now. Mm-hmm. And there's more to come. I mean, the big thing, you know, that changes all of us, I think, is when we get the diagnosis, you know, or the piano falls on our head. Yeah. But in terms, short of that, you know, what we could do is just look around our life. what wants to be known that we're not willing to know?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's actually, we could look at, you know, Damali, and I think you too, Lee, you know, you've done so much therapy, so much coaching, you're a therapist, you're in your own right, and coaches, that's a lot of what we're doing with is helping people see what they're unwilling to see, you know, and that is one of the engines of evolution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've watched you over a couple of years now where you've had this kind of puzzle around
Torment.
Yeah, I've watched you a little bit around
Yeah,
that.
yeah. You know, my parenting strategy for my dogs, Namali, is that they never have an unpleasant moment.
Yeah. Right.
It's not that great, actually, but that's it.
Yeah. So something that I've been really curious, particularly about you, Jeff, is something that you're really good at because of your integral orientation, is that I think you have a natural inclination, even as a type 5 on the Enneagram, who is fear driven in many ways. You really show through your podcast, through conversations that you have with us, that you have a positive orientation somehow, that you kind of continuously see and you understand that something going wrong is just how it's going wrong. It's just a part of the evolutionary process, perhaps. It may be very unfortunate, but that's what's happening. So in that, sometimes I also struggle a little bit to understand whether you actually have a true deep concern also. Like, because you seem so positive often, and me being the Enneagram 4, I sometimes want to like drag out of you, all right, Jeff, like, come on, like with integral, you seem to think that everything's gonna be fine in the future and everything that's going wrong is just a part of the process. So I get that, but I also want to know, I'm really curious to know from you, so what are you? Does anything really like concern you deeply, break your heart deeply? Like what actually, especially looking at emergence and the future and what we are potentially walking into? What's a deep, deep concern for you? What's a deep heartbreak for you?
Yeah. Well, animals.
Okay.
For one. Yeah, big time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a biggie. And just to continue with that just a bit, the understanding of the culture of all animals, birds, fish, you know, that they're living in, they have 4 quadrants too. So that is a big heartbreak for me. The other is well, in a way, I would sort of reframe the way of thinking about it. Is that I don't think everything's going to be okay. I don't even consider myself to be an optimist, honestly. What I want to note is the updraft of evolution, not because that's all there is, but just because nobody else is doing it. You know, everybody's got some complaint about how the world is and some version of this shouldn't be happening. It's awful that it is. I can't stand it. And somebody needs to be blamed. You know, that's the whole cascade of that. I feel that way about all kinds of things. You know, lots of things are absolutely outrageous. That somebody by the name of Juan or Jamal would not get the responses to a resume that somebody named John would still. You know, that there's just that natural racism, that there's a natural, that the poverty exists, that there are people struggling to eat, that there are, that all of that is absolutely outrageous. The elephants, you know, the poisoning of the environment, the mindless lumbering of modernity and capitalism and the forests and all of that stuff. I mean, I remember living in Florida, and there's just growth everywhere. And, you know, it was the kind of growth where what they would do would just basically bring bulldozers in and just bulldoze the whole, basically forest, and trees and swampy whatever, and build, a parking lot and a CVS and a bank. And watching that, as much as I then went to the bank and ate at the restaurant, and that became part of my life, the heartbreak, again, this is the hypocrisy that I want to, maybe I do hide in it. Maybe it's part of my privilege that I don't have to see it. It's part of my fiveness that I don't want to see it. But I get it, that it's there. And it's all heartbreaking. And what is more important than that to me, though, is that there's this other thing going on that is not talked about enough. I'm not going to say I'm the only one talking about it, but there is an updraft. I mean, if you want to look at the emergence of green consciousness on the planet, it was brought forth because of World War II and the ultimate ruination of all triumphalist stories about race, religion, all of the conquest, all of it, which it burned out of the human system. Well, that was somewhere between 50 and 75 million deaths. Every one of them a story. Every one of them a universe. And so what I notice is that postmodernity came online because of that, and that there is it's like the evolution of goodness, truth, and beauty is actually brought forth in the world by their opposites, by things that are ugly, untrue, and bad. And that's also true of, what they say, nature is red in tooth and claw. I mean, all of these wonderful animals, they ain't so great with each other either, actually, if you want to look at the wild. And so, the way God kills animals is he has something run them down and eat their stomach out while they're still alive, because that's the best part. It's half digested. That's how God does it. This is a horrible universe in many ways. And this gets me to something that I think is also important, that there's a spiritual side to this, where on one hand, this is where it is sort of an expansion to the Big Bang. The whole universe is a big roiling cauldron of things coming and going, and suffering, and being burned at the stake, and hitting. I mean, if you look at, like I said, human history, if you can imagine it, we've done it to each other, and what we still do to each other. And there's sort of, in a way, this is integral. There's two streams of sort of spiritual ways of dealing with that. One is what we've loosely call Western, and the other is loosely Eastern. One is sort of transcend it and realize that I'm bigger than this. I don't have any preferences. I can live or die. Suffering is the same as joy, praise and blame, gain or loss. All of that stuff is ephemeral. I come and I go, and yet there's something that transcends all of this. And so that's been a great succor to me. That's that Eastern thing. And then the Western thing is that I live on in this identity in a way that enables me to forgive all of it. And I remember listening to an Anglican priest talk where he said that maybe it's this way, that a little child who is tortured in this life, like the worst thing we could think of, that what God would allow that? What's that about? And that maybe what it's about is that child actually gets, through living and growing, gets to forgive their perpetrator, and that there is an expansion of consciousness, that loving, flowing forgiveness. And I don't know if either of them are satisfactory to explain the suffering of this world, but I don't, in some ways I feel that the complaints that we have about the world are also ways of not feeling it. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And so I'm doing my best as a kind of, hard-hearted 5. You know, you have to give me a little break. And,
Yeah.
I like to think my feelings. But thank you very much. Uh,
Well, it was nice to hear you to speak about that. Somehow there was something in me that felt like I want to hear you
yeah. Was
speak.
that satisfactory, or is there any part that's still glitchy, or because, God bless you. You have a different, you're bringing a whole new stream of Namaliness to the picture. And I want
Well,
to,
it's just it's nothing that is a right or wrong answer to any
right,
of that.
exactly. Yes.
There is none of that, and we're all different, and we all experience the world differently. But sometimes I have that curiosity just uniquely about you. It's like
Mm-hmm.
how sometimes I feel like I'm not sure how I feel your heart.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to hear a little bit into that, and I was kind of gonna just pose that question
Mm-hmm.
completely out of curiosity. Not ever. I don't think I have ever doubted that you care deeply,
Mm-hmm.
and I have seen your heart breaking.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no doubt about that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it was
It's
good to still hear you.
Yeah, it's a heartbreaking place. Eesh.
So
I
maybe
mean,
one
really.
last question, maybe,
Well,
and
actually, there's just one thing that comes to mind. I'll add to that, and I feel this, and I don't know if it really happened. It's apocryphal. It's a story that's told about a carving on the wall of Auschwitz, one of the barracks in Auschwitz, and I think this is legit too. And it read, "When I meet the Almighty, He's going to ask for my forgiveness." Yeah, it's like, enough with this. The suffering is too much. But, you know, what can you say?
yeah,
You just get on with it.
yeah.
And so, anyway, yes. One last question.
Okay, so Jeff, the last question is, if you could give people one piece of life advice, what would that be?
Well, yeah, you know, this is a practice. This idea of getting bigger, of seeing more, of challenging your conditioned mind and all your sort of, grooves of thought, and not just thought, of feeling, all these ways you are sure you see the world, that just, just as thought experiments, let other things in, let other feelings in. And uh, and I say this is a practice. So and I love the definition of practice. I forget where I got it, but you pick these things up. But practice is the thing we do to be faithful, not successful. And that's just, I love that, because faithful to what? Well, faithful to, and this is I got from you, Namali, faithful to the one thing that you can believe in, emergence itself.
Yeah.
So faith in the capital E emergence, that there's a procreate urge. And so I can participate in that. And I can look from a bigger view and not just my narrow view, or not just, what's going to happen in November with Trump and Biden. We care, we do our part, but we don't have to marinate in that. We don't have to contract around that. We can have a bigger view that sees that, yeah, the world is unraveling, the world's gone mad, but compared to what in history, first of all? And that we can also see that the world's actually getting saner in many ways, that there's a great raveling that's happening. It's not just unraveling. And in what ways is it raveling? And also for me personally, how am I raveling? And as well as unraveling, was I supposed to stay 12? Did I think that 14 was going to be better than 12? It's actually in many ways worse. But there you go. And then, you don't like 14, try 24. And onward. It's so that's the nature of evolution. It's just growth is, it's treacherous, but that's what we have. And so I'd encourage people to do that as a practice, not so you get it, but just so you take another little thousandth of an onion skin off of the straitjacket you're in. and, you know, breathe a little bit. So that's what I'd say. And have a laugh. Jesus.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's always good to hear from you, Jeff. And
Oh,
thank you for joining Lee and I. We really enjoyed having many conversations with you, and
yes.
you offer a lot, and you give so much. You're generous with what you do often.
Thank you.
So I wish my little Duncan was here. He would love to see you.
Oh, my little Dunky. Dunky is my dog's cousin, and he
Yes,
comes and visits, and we spend many days together.
yes.
So I'm looking forward to seeing Dunky again. So
Yeah.
actually, thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure to be with you, and I'll continue this conversation with you anytime.
All right.
All
Well,
right.
next, my dear friends.
Yes,
Until
indeed.
next
Yeah, see you
time.
the next time. Thanks
Thanks,
everyone for
everybody.
watching.
All
Thanks,
righty.
Jeff. Thanks,
See you
Namali.
next time.